Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at a massive structural shift happening right now in Australia's higher education sector. We're going to explore how Australian universities are navigating strict new international student enrollment caps by strategically pivoting offshore. And we'll uncover the hidden strains this kind of borderless digital expansion is creating behind the scenes.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the central tension we're unpacking today. For decades, international education has been an absolute pillar of the Australian economy. But suddenly, we're seeing a massive collision between new government migration policies and the relentless mandate for university growth. Think about it. If the government essentially puts a speed limit on the number of students you can physically bring into the country, how do you continue to expand your university?
Part 1. The Student Cap Squeeze. To really understand this offshore solution, we first need to understand the onshore squeeze. What's really interesting here is the government's National Planning Level, or the NPL. This is basically the strict limit on new international student commencements. In 2025, that cap was set at 270,000. But for 2026, it bumps up to 295,000. And crucially, it's being held perfectly steady at that 295,000 mark for 2027 as well. The government's strategy here is twofold. They want to return to pre-pandemic enrollment levels, sure, but they also want to give the education sector a rare 2-year run of stability so they can actually plan their operations without getting into a fresh political fight over the cap every single year.
But you might be wondering, why cap them at all? Well, it largely comes down to domestic infrastructure pressures, specifically the housing and rental market crisis. The data here is honestly fascinating. Nationwide, international students only make up about 4% of the total rental market. Now, it sounds tiny, right? But the impact isn't spread evenly at all. These students are heavily concentrated in just 13 specific local government areas, mostly clustered right around major city campuses. In some of those specific suburbs, international students make up nearly a quarter of all renters. So while they're just a small piece of the national pie, their localized impact is intense, which is exactly what's driving the government to cap physical arrivals.
However, capping these numbers carries a massive economic risk. Universities Australia has flat out warned that restricting these numbers is like taking a sledgehammer to the economy. We're talking about Australia's fourth largest industry here. It injects over $50 billion into the economy and supports more than 250,000 jobs. Plus, universities rely incredibly heavily on these international student fees to cross-subsidize their research and domestic teaching, especially since government funding has pretty much plateaued. So they are absolutely desperate for an alternative growth strategy. They literally can't just stop growing. Part 2. The offshore exemption. So, if you can't bring the students to Australia, what do? You take Australia to the students. When the government designed the national planning level, they actually carved out a few specific exemptions. Things like high school students, research degrees, and certain government scholars don't count towards the cap. But the absolute golden ticket for universities is transnational education, or TNE arrangements. Which brings us to the biggest question. If an Australian university enrolls a student at an offshore campus, do they contribute to that overall student enrollment cap? The answer is a resounding no. They are completely excluded, which gives universities this brilliant, totally legal strategic loophole to keep expanding. And this brilliantly illustrates the strategic appeal. An onshore student requires an Australian student visa, which, by the way, has been getting way harder to process. They consume local housing in those heavily concentrated suburbs we talked about, and they eat up a precious spot in the university's NIPL cap. But an offshore student, they require absolutely zero Australian visas. They use zero local housing, and they're totally exempt from the cap. For a university looking to scale, this offshore digital and physical hybrid model offers virtually unrestricted, borderless potential. We are already seeing this play out incredibly aggressively. Right now, 8 Australian universities are establishing international branch campuses across India. We're talking key locations like Gift City, Mumbai, Chennai, and Greater Noida. The strategy they're using here is asset-light expansion. So rather than spending hundreds of millions building massive dorms and huge lecture halls, they're offering Indian students globally recognized Australian degrees at up to 50% lower tuition costs. They're focusing entirely on academic delivery, quality assurance, and heavy digital integration. It dramatically lowers their financial risk, taps into massive student populations, and completely bypasses those onshore caps. Part 3. The hidden digital strain. But look, there's no such thing as a free lunch. By keeping students overseas, the Australian government is explicitly excluding them to encourage institutional growth without straining domestic rental markets or infrastructure. But doesn't this just shift an immense amount of pressure directly onto a university's existing budget, digital infrastructure, and academic staff to actually deliver that education? The short answer is absolutely yes. To run a hyper-flexible offshore model, you suddenly need an incredibly robust digital architecture that can serve thousands of students across multiple different time zones simultaneously, and you need the staff to manage it 24/7.
To really grasp why this is breaking the system internally, we have to talk about EFTSL. That stands for Equivalent Full-Time Student Load. This is the absolute bedrock metric that universities and the government use to calculate funding and, critically, figure out how much work an academic staff member should actually be doing. But here's the problem. EFTSL is deeply predicated on traditional time-limited semesters. It assumes a student takes a class for 12 weeks, sits an exam, and leaves. When you move to offshore, continuous digital education with rolling enrollments and hyper-flexible terms, this traditional metric just completely shatters. You literally cannot accurately measure or compensate staff for the ongoing, non-stop demands of borderless students.
Let's move on and see how this builds up, because this systemic mismatch translates directly into real-world friction for educators. A national study of Australian business schools pinpointed exactly where this digital scalability hits a wall. For one, maintaining academic integrity across borders is just incredibly difficult. Beyond that, it requires massive additional time and effort from teachers to design diverse online assessments, troubleshoot technology access, and manage the round-the-clock expectations of students who frankly demand immediate feedback. What looks like infinite digital scalability on a spreadsheet very often translates to severe staff burnout in reality. Part 4. Quality control and compliance. So, the crucial point is that the government is acutely aware that rapid, unregulated offshore expansion could threaten the very thing that makes Australian education valuable in the first place, its global reputation. So they're amending the law to tighten the leash. Providers seeking to engage in offshore delivery will now be strictly monitored by TQSA, the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency. This is definitely no longer a free-for-all. To offer or confer an Australian higher education award offshore, a university now has to obtain and maintain explicit authorization from the regulator. And if the quality drops, that authorization gets pulled. This introduces entirely new compliance realities for these universities. They now have to notify TQSA whenever they start or stop an offshore course, or even just change who they're partnering with. Plus, starting in 2026, they'll have to submit these really complex annual reports detailing all their offshore delivery activities. Now, groups representing the top universities, like the Group of 8, are practically begging the government to keep this regulation light touch. They're arguing that if you drown them in administrative reporting, it just amplifies that massive budget strain we just talked about and totally defeats the whole purpose of the agile, asset-light expansion they desperately need to survive the onshore caps. Which leaves us with this final, vital question. To protect its domestic housing and infrastructure, Australia is effectively exporting its higher education sector through digital and offshore campuses. It is a very elegant loophole to the enrollment caps, but as the physical strain is alleviated at home, that pressure is entirely transferred to the university's digital architecture and academic workforce. So, are we actually solving an infrastructure crisis, or have we simply moved it to the cloud? It's something the entire sector is going to be wrestling with over the next few years. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.